Thanks a lot for the invitation. This stems from a talk I gave a few years ago where I publicly acknowledged the privilege that I have as a result of several aspects about me. Interestingly, sort of after the fact, one that I felt very difficult acknowledging was my whiteness and how much privilege that brings me in my life. So I'm going to try to do a little bit better job today, and I think that's just an example of evolution. And so we can forgive ourselves when we make mistakes, when we talk about diversity, and we can learn from things and move forward. Okay, but I wanted to talk about, I was invited to talk about, well, often people talk about STEM, but I think that STEAM is more interesting. I've seen this acronym, Science and Technology Interpreted Through Engineering and Arts Based on Math, which sounds pretty good, but is linear. And I'd like to think of the letters more as a wheel, like intersections. So the intersection between science, which is understanding, and engineering, which is solving problems, can lead towards technology. The intersection between math and science leads to computer and data science. The intersection between art and science, I think, is design. So it's easy for me to speak as a cisgendered white woman, but I do have a lot of privilege, and I would like to try to amplify some other voices. So I titled this talk, Cis Women, Trans Women, Women of Color. Let's see. I don't remember being made to feel that I shouldn't be in a science field because I was a woman, and I'm not sure if that's because I was lucky or oblivious. Probably it was the latter, actually. One thing that some people know is that I have a daughter with a disability, and as I come to learn the hill that she has to climb in her life, it's easier for me to see the hills that other people have to climb in their lives. Okay. So I want to do some definitions. Stereotype, an exaggerated belief, or a distorted truth about a group. So all Kenyans run fast. All Indian people are good at IT. All women are naturally good at childcare. These are stereotypes. When taken too far, they lead towards a prejudice so that you prejudge and you don't allow for the fact that an Indian might be good at business, or an Indian might be a good artist, or a woman might not be good at childcare. And then if that goes too far, then you get to discrimination, where if women are only good at childcare, then they shouldn't be in science. So that's where I wanted to start with some definitions. And then we have these biases. Everybody has biases. Whether we want to acknowledge it or not, we all have biases. An easy one for me to admit is that I am biased against people who smoke because I just don't get it. But I think that we all have residual biases that prevent us from fully appreciating other people's struggles. And so studies have shown white interviewers sit farther away from black interviewees. White interviewers spend less time talking to black interviewees. And it's not, I'd like to think that it's not conscious, at least mostly, but I think it does stem from this, what we're taught by osmosis in this country and other countries, and it is just really hard to get rid of. Okay, I also want to talk about a few more things. So intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in '89, because she saw in the legal field, I think is where she was working, that her identity as a black woman was very specific. And when people did research about black people in law, it was mostly men. And when people did research about women in law, it was mostly white women. And so as a black woman in particular, she articulated interlocking oppressions, oppressed for different kinds of reasons. Maybe you've heard this word, misogynoir. I'm not super good at saying it. Coined by Moya Bailey in 2008 to describe the racialized misogyny aimed specifically at black women. So you might start to hear this term. Hopefully you're hearing this term a little bit more. I also want to talk about cultural appropriation or misappropriation just briefly. Sometimes this comes up where people don't really understand the definition of cultural misappropriation. So I think I found the cultural elements copied from a minority culture by people from a majority culture. And then the people from the minority culture don't get the credit for it. They don't get the revenue from it. They don't even get acknowledged that it comes from there. culture. And sometimes the majority uses it against the express witness wishes of the people from the originating culture. And sometimes you see this play out in that there's a particular aspect of a minority culture that can be mocked at first, plagiarized second, and then mainstream. And I think that an example could be white rappers, where in the beginning spoken word was not really appreciated, and then it was plagiarized, and now it's mainstream. I'll be happy to take feedback on that. So now I want to set some context on why this all matters. So kind of what's the big deal? This McKinsey report from 2007 said if you increase the women in your organization, you increase the ROI. So if Fortune 500 companies had at least 3 women, they saw better return on invested capital, better sales, better return on equity. So there's a legitimate business case for including women in leadership roles. But despite that legitimate data, I mean, there's data, we still only own 5% of tech startups. Women still are only 7% of partners at the top 100 VC firms, hold 11% of positions in Silicon Valley. So why is that? It's not explained by inherent disinterest in math and science. Probably everybody knows that girls are really interested in math and science right up until middle school. And then all of a sudden at middle school, it becomes really hard. They say, math is hard, I'm not good at this. Some of my friends at work really struggled because their daughters would get A's and say, I'm not good at math. And the dad is thinking, why can't I convince you? Here's objective data, but it's just something inherent. So statistics do show that 74% of girls express interest in STEM, but young girls are being deterred. And how does that happen? Here's a study from 2007. The title of the study is up there. So 3rd grade girls and boys asked to solve some math problems, and half of them, they had their gender activated. So something gender specific was said to them about how their appearance perhaps, or some activity that they liked. And the activation of that gender identity affected the girls' performance, but not the boys' performance. Girls solved more difficult problems, more problems when it was less difficult, but then when it got to be more difficult, they underperformed when their gender was activated, not in the control case. I have learned that even something as innocuous as teaching our kids how to ride a bike. When we teach our sons how to ride a bike, we give them information. Keep your center of mass above the center of the bike. Push evenly on both feet. And when we teach our girls to ride a bike and they don't get it immediately, we say, that's okay, honey. You can try again tomorrow. So we tend to give boys more facts. We tend to give them more information about how to be successful. And we tend to treat girls with sympathy. And that really, I think, sticks. This is a short, it is not a short 1-minute YouTube video. So it's the Verizon commercial that has a little girl. She's like 2. She's reaching towards a dandelion. Then she's 4. She's getting rocks out of the stream, and her mother says, sweetie, don't get your dress dirty. And then she's painting planets and hanging them in her room, and the mom says, it's time to come clean up the kitchen. And then she's using a cordless drill, building a model with her brother, and her dad says, that looks too difficult for you, let your brother do it. And then she's walking through the high school hallway and sees a sign for a science fair, and she puts lipstick on looking at the reflection. Then there's this thing called the Mathilde Effect. I don't know if anybody's heard of the Mathilde Effect. And so it's the contribution of women scientists get erased over time. So how many women here feel like you haven't been heard the first time you said something? Or it doesn't get considered until a man says it. Right? This happens. It happens all the time. But if there are multiple women, we can amplify each other. and we can pile on and say what that person said is correct. And if I go back to that McKinsey study from 2007, it said 3 women in leadership. It didn't say 1. It said 3. You have to have kind of a critical mass. You have to have enough people who can reinforce each other. I don't know if you watched the David Letterman interviews that are on Netflix, and he had Tina Fey, and he talked about, she said, you never hired women as writers, and he said, I didn't think women wanted to be writers, and she said, yes, we did. And then she talked about you need to have a few, it can't be just one, and there was a time when she was the head writer at SNL, and somebody pitched a joke, and the men in the room didn't get it, so it could have been easily squashed. But the rest of the women in the room said, no, this is why it's funny. But they had to explain it to the men in the room in order to get the joke on the show. So women's contributions, if there aren't enough women or somebody else who can amplify, gets erased. And so Marie Curie, I think that we all think, hey, Marie Curie, she's recognized, but only at the insistence of a mathematician, of a male mathematician. So we need allies, we need people who can help. And so here's some statistics from 2011 about why women leave technology. And I think it's interesting to ask, okay, but is this acceptable? Are these numbers good numbers or bad numbers? And kind of what's the cause underneath them? Is it really that women didn't like the work? Like, does that resonate? Women don't like the work and that's why they leave? The organizational climate, they don't like the culture, work-life integration. There must be something specific about policies or how the environment is that leads women to articulate these things. So although I wanted to title the talk Women in STEAM, it's actually not too much research on STEAM. There's a lot of research on STEM. So now I want to talk just a little bit about the arts. So here's some statistics that I didn't know. I was shocked to know. And so the fact that I was shocked to know these, I think, is another example or another data point in that we have to be willing to learn things that we don't already know. I mean, maybe that's an obvious thing to say. But in terms of expertise outside our own, be open to learning that there's something new and different, because I didn't know any of these statistics. Okay. Often, whenever I try to talk about inclusion, I get, prove to me that it's so bad. Why is it so bad? Show me the numbers. And the numbers are there. This was, 3 minutes of searching. The numbers are totally there. So believe people when they say it's bad. There are things that are going on. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And there's no clock in the room, and I have to check the time. Oh, boy. Okay, so all my data so far is mainly white cisgendered women. So I realized that I didn't have enough references about black women. So on the coffee table, I left some lists of references, but none of the, like NSBE and Nobuche, aren't there. But here's something that I got from NSBE, the National Society of Black Engineers. And you can see that the number of African American women in STEM have declined. Hispanic women have gone up. Asian American women have stayed pretty flat. And so there are some different numbers based on the different people who conduct the studies. But generally speaking, it's not easy to be in one of these minority categories. And why do we think Asian Americans are as high as it is? I think it's probably because of the stereotyping that all Asian people are smart. And we have stereotyping that black people aren't good at math and science or aren't smart. Studies that are on race are mostly about men. Studies that are on gender are mostly about white women. But it's the intersection that I think is something that we don't talk about enough. So the intersection of race and gender, there really aren't that many role models. I don't know how many black women we have in Alfred in leadership roles. We have I'm going to say like 6 at Corning. It's not very many. And that really matters. You have that stereotype threat. So people tend to underperform on standardized tests, especially if they're reminded about their race or their gender, which we talked about earlier. You have this biculturalism problem. So you're implicitly expected to behave differently at work than you are at home, and you have to constantly sort out, like, who am I, where am I, what's my audience? So I do have a friend who shared with me that she has to decide every time she enters a room, how black am I going to be? How techie am I going to be? How feminine am I going to be? How religious am I going to be? And she constantly has to navigate that water wherever she goes. You also have tokenism. So when my kid with a disability has a bad day, people look at her and they're making generalizations about all people with her particular kind of disability. But when we've got people in the majority who have a bad day, no one extends that to the majority. And you can see that played out in how people of different races are treated by police, for example. So when it's somebody, the Jussie Smollett thing, right? So he's bad because he made this stuff up. There are 2,000 hate crimes, and this one we're going to use to generalize to say that hate crimes aren't actually a big deal. That's tokenism. Okay. Then I found this study, Climate and Physics report from just 2018, where they asked one question to identify as either heterosexual or a sexual minority. They asked one question, and they got a lot of really negative feedback about just even the existence of the question, either denying that that's an issue or objecting to the question as offensive. And you can see in the data that people who identify as a sexual minority have less retention in STEM fields. And one comment, I'd rather be a gay man than a straight woman any day. I think that gender plays a much bigger role than orientation. Okay, sexual minority, I think, includes sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. Sexual orientation is who you're attracted to. Gender identity is the gender you believe yourself to be. Gender expression is the gender you wish to present to the world. And none of those three things are related. Another way that some people think about gender identity is between your ears, and sex is between your legs, if you hadn't heard that. Okay. So what? Why is this still such a big deal? So I think that some people insist that identity doesn't matter if you're being objective, and I think that 30 years ago I was in that same boat. I was a little bit of a not disability, but diversity denier. Like, if you just come in and you do your job, how hard is that going to be? Not really realizing all the cards that are kind of stacked against people who don't identify as in the mainstream. And some people think, okay, yeah, there's a little inequality, but that's tangential to anything that we're doing here in STEM fields or STEAM fields. But it really doesn't take into account how people shape the questions that they ask, the things that they want to study. And it doesn't take into account this hostile experiences thing. They tend to be looked at as isolated incidents, so not tokenism, rather than a systemic problem. And so here's just a tweet from a week ago, that almost every single student who responded with stories about a problematic advisor was female. So not every woman advisor is bad, but a lot of women have had really negative experiences with their advisor. What does that mean? So this is one thing I have about transgendered men who have a unique experience. So these are female to male. And here's Ben Bars. He saw an almost immediate difference in his everyday experience. People who didn't know that he was transgendered treated him with much more respect than when he expressed as a woman. Somebody actually said, Ben gave a great seminar today, but his work is so much better than his sister's, not knowing that it's the same person. And he acknowledges this is why women are not breaking into academic jobs. He's taken more seriously. And another F to M, female to male, transgender person, when I was a woman, didn't matter how many facts I had, people are like, are you sure? Sure about that? People who work for me in my current job argue with me more than they did my predecessor. He would say something and it would be taken. And I say something and I get a lot of discussion. And I spent some time trying to decide what am I going to do about that. And I could be more forceful and I could be a jerk. And then I would get labeled as aggressive, right? Assertive, difficult to work with. So that's a choice that I had to make. And in fact, I would rather be more consensus-driven. In fact, I think it would be denying the very value that I bring, which is appreciating diverse perspectives. So if I did go too far on the, hey, I'm the boss, you're going to listen to me sort of route, then I'm not having an environment where people can talk to me. So it's this trade-off, right? So I get argued with more than my predecessor did, but on the other hand, I think we get a better outcome. Okay, so that's background, what I wanted to cover. So I want to turn to some examples of who is doing what today. And the first thing is reply guy. So I don't know if you've heard reply guy. Whenever a woman would post something online or share an experience, there's a backlash. And these two people categorized all the backlash in terms of 9 different categories that are shown on the screen. And also I have a few handouts in case you're interested. And we're just gonna, oh, and the other thing I wanted to point out right here, it says, inspired by #MeTooSTEM. Anybody know who started the #MeToo hashtag? Alyssa Milano? Anybody think so? Alyssa Milano? Now you're all knowing that I'm gonna try to trick you, so nobody wants to volunteer. So Alyssa Milano in 2017 started using the hashtag, and it took her 3 days, maybe it only took her 3 days, to acknowledge that it was Tarana Burke from 2010 who started really using the #MeToo hashtag in her MySpace account. And so there's just another their examples are everywhere. All you got to do is open your eyes a little bit and see these examples everywhere of people taking other people's work and not getting credit for it. But anyway, so here's some, I don't know how this is on the screen. Yeah, you can't see it. So I just want to read a few of these, actually. So somebody posts, this professor hit on me, something like that. And the life coach responses would be, I would have shouted no and kicked his butt. It's easy. Or choose your battles, tough it out, focus on the science and you'll be fine. Otherwise known as victim blaming, free advice, or you got this. The problem is that it demands solutions from the victim. You may also hear this from women. And what should men do when they see women complain about those things? They should stop replying and start listening. You probably have heard about mansplaining. Where's mansplaining? Well, then there's the himpathy. So I had trouble with my male advisor, and then people will respond with, not all men. This is the not all men response. You just ran into that one guy. Or don't attack me. I need to feel more safe than you need to feel safe, otherwise called himpathy. So the problem with that is that only men are real. Only men's pain is real pain. Women's pain is not real pain. Oh, there's mansplainer. So you probably all heard about mansplaining. So this was coined 2014, I think, by Rebecca Stolnit, I think her name was. She wrote a book, and she went to a party in Colorado, and it kind of came up in conversation, and this man said, I don't know if you've read this book, and she said, yeah, I wrote it, and she had to say it 3 times before he actually heard her. It was terrible. Oops. So these 9 categories of replies, generally speaking, when a woman puts herself out there, there's some backlash. It can be categorized in one of these 9 ways. And so how do we use it kind of in the wild, in real life? So here's another side of Me Too. Male managers fearful of mentoring women in the New York Times in January of this year. Male managers are fearful of mentoring women. And there was a lot of replies that were like, oh no, I can't talk to women now because I'm going to be under attack. And so here's how somebody used it at 9 Reply Guys. Wonderful look at a herd of number 5s in the wild. These brave male executives speaking on the condition of anonymity. Here's one where a man says, he quotes, invariably, the word you used, I don't think it means what you think it means. My experience over many years. And so the 9 reply guys say, that uses a variety of approaches to suggest this particular black woman and marginalized people of color in general probably aren't worth listening to, which is classic projection. Find him on the grid under Mansplainer, Sea Lion, and The Prestige. Another example of how this can be used. Why are women so exhausted? We live in a world designed for men. I don't know if you read this article in The Guardian. So everything, crash test dummies are 1.7 meters tall and 70 kilograms. The average woman is way less than 1.7 meters tall and 70 kilograms. So all of the safety systems in cars are designed for that physical build. And there aren't very many women that fit that physical build. The same is true for countertop height. The same is true for the size of a smartphone. The same is true for stab vests. So Kevlar uniforms don't fit women the same way. And they can get stabbed because their vest doesn't fit them because they're not designed for them. So here's a response. I'm a 6-foot-tall woman. I can't express enough that men's clothes don't fit me either. And here's a man. I'm a man, and men's clothes don't fit me either. Feel bad for me. And so she says, hi there, I'm not in the mood for your comment. Number 3, gaslighter. This sounds like male bashing. I'm sure to some of you this sounds like male bashing. And my intent isn't to bash. My intent is to try to get people to acknowledge that we all have things to learn. Again, the focus on this has all been white cisgendered women and also STEM. So let's look a little bit about art. So people may know about the Guerrilla Girls. Do women have to be naked to get into the Met? I love this when I saw it. I did not know that less than 5% of artists are women, but 85% of the nudes are women. And the Guerrilla Girls reframe the question. Why haven't there been more great women artists? That's not the question. The question is, why haven't more women been considered great artists? And there's a couple of organizations that are working in this space to try to make changes. So American Women Artists is mainly an online organization, but they had this 25 and 25 initiative to secure exhibitions. And there was one actually in Corning just 2 years ago at the Rockwell. So they're trying to be really deliberate about getting women's voices out there and in the public. Here's another one I found. Transgender Herstory in 99 Objects, an exploration of artifacts in the history of transgender communities. And I didn't know that major museums often present 100 objects from their collections that construct definitive narratives. So the creators of this traveling exhibit deliberately did 99 objects, purposefully showing the forever incomplete task of representing history. Turning to Black voices, we've got blurreds. I don't know how many people have heard that word blurred. It stands for black nerd. And so that's a perfectly valid subculture that people don't think about. Black people aren't nerds, only white people are nerds. No, black people are nerds. So this is Brittany Young. She's from Baltimore, and she's teaching youth about the wonders of STEM by applying it to dirt bikes, which is 2 things. She's from inner city, and there aren't that many resources in inner city. And she's got this really great full-time engineering job, and she's doing this kind of on the side, B360. And she's taking it to kids. She's starting early, before the kids get to that middle school point where they say, I'm no good at math, I'm no good at science. And she's meeting them where they are on dirt bikes. So she's finding something that they can relate to. She's not trying to, do a bunch of stuff with beakers and titration in the lab. No offense, Andy, sorry. But meet kids where they are. Another voice from today is Lynne Conway. So she says, when pioneers disappear from history, tech leader Lynne Conway explores why women and underrepresented minorities lose credit for their contributions over time, again from 2019. Why this is important is because Lynn's transgendered. So she joined research, IBM in 1964, invented this really cool plan that made possible the creation of first superscalar computers. And then she moved to Silicon Valley, and she was the one that led this revolution in microchip design that led to VLSI in Silicon Valley. She's the reason why we all have all these integrated circuit chips and everything in our pockets for phones, for those of us that have big enough pockets to hold microphones, which I do not because I have girl clothes. Another voice of today is Jane Cook. So she's local scientist and artist. She's chief scientist at the museum. I know she's been here a couple of times. She gave a lecture, behind the glass lecture that's on YouTube. I know some students from Alfred were there, and I think Professor LaCourse. She also identifies as transgender. So one thing I wanted to mention here is you can find ways to be an ally to people. So I knew her first by her birth name, and then when she said, I prefer to be called Jane, often people will call her by her birth name. It doesn't take very much from me to say, so Jane, what do you think about? So I'm not calling out the person who used the incorrect name, but I'm reaffirming Jane's preferred name or her actual name. So there are ways that you can figure out how to be an ally. Okay. So there's still a bunch of issues that prevent full participation from diverse people. There's a quick snapshot of some of today's voices. And I can't do justice to this topic in 45 minutes, right? I mean, there are week-long seminars on any one of these slices. So this is really, hopefully, just a survey. But moving forward, what are the things that could help? Leadership and accountability. Some of this may start to feel redundant, some of these slides. So it might be repetitive, but I think that just means that it's really important. So when it shows up in multiple sources, I think it means that it's something impactful and we should pay attention to. So how do we train managers in best practices? How do we create a culture, provide development and visibility opportunities? How do we support networks and communities, sponsor resource groups, have flexible work arrangements, leave policies? And if we go back to the Why Women Leave, were these sort of programs in place in those organizations that led women to leave? How interwoven is it? The work arrangements and the leave policies acknowledges that although work equality at home is also getting better, the majority of women do most of the work at home as on top of their full daytime jobs. And even when there are some families that have a little bit better balance in terms of chores, the woman also bears most of the mental load, which is deciding what has to happen. What are we going to have for dinner? So husbands will say, what should I cook for dinner? Thinking they're being really helpful by cooking dinner. But if you could also take the mental load of deciding what to cook for dinner and keeping all the stuff in your head, that would also be really helpful for some families. Okay. In professional societies, could we use faculty as talent scouts? Can we train department chairs and search committees on being extra sensitive to these kinds of issues? Can we let grad students know about family or partner-friendly policies? Can we include more women on search committees? These ideas are not new, I don't think, but I also don't know how widely we use them everywhere. We could proactively nominate women for awards. We could run professional development programs. We could conduct gender equity survey on an annual basis. 1 year at Corning, I got a larger than expected raise, and 2 years later, we announced that we had achieved pay equity. I was like, huh, okay, well, I mean, I'm glad we achieved pay equity. I didn't realize I was underpaid. Hold on, where am I? Slide 29. Oh yeah, the last one. Institute a policy of zero tolerance for bullying and harassment. A lot of times people think zero tolerance means immediate dismissal, and that I don't think that's what it should mean. So I think zero tolerance means nothing slides, nothing gets by, everything gets addressed. It can be feedback, it can be coaching, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean it shouldn't mean that people get fired at the first thing because we're all evolving, because we did things 5 years ago, 15 years ago, 30 years ago that we're embarrassed by, that now we would never do. Does that mean that for every transgression that we have, we should immediately get terminated? I don't think so. Okay. For LGBT, LGBT inclusive curriculums, there's a lot of data on there that we're not binary, we're not this or that. There's lots of spectrum for both orientation as well as sex roles. And it's not fair number of animals have same-sex mating. So including that kind of thing in our biology classes or in any of the conversations that we have lets people know that we create room for them. We could acknowledge the totality of the lives of people who we respect. So Sally Ride was a physicist, an astronaut, and a lesbian, but that hardly ever gets mentioned. Annie Leibovitz is a photographer and portraitist and a lesbian, but her total identity doesn't often get shared or discussed, which means that it can be minimized. The Gay and Lesbian Science and Engineering Network had a national school climate. Seniors whose STEM curriculum included positive LGBT content were twice as likely to stay. It matters, it really does. You can have allies. So this is an example of a Corning Allies card. We put these, any person who is willing to have an allies card in their office does so, and it says that it's a safe space. Sullivan Park is a notoriously difficult place to figure out where you are, and I have a friend of mine who identifies as a lesbian, and she couldn't figure out where she was, and she saw an allies card, and she knocked on that door. She didn't knock on the other door, she knocked on the door with the allies card. So out allies can make a real impact. I found some stuff on Carnegie Mellon and Harvey Mudd. Often when men are in the majority of a study, they have an informal network. They have a fraternity or there's a group of guys. There's enough guys that you have a network. And when you're in a minority, there's not enough people to use as a network. So then start a network. Start a formal mentoring program for people who look like they could be alone. And CMU is having a really positive impact. I think Alfred is doing a bunch of this kind of stuff that Harvey Mudd is doing. I see lots of diversity in all of the advertising. And I think that we are doing the hosting camps for high school students and all of that stuff. For art, can you name 5 women artists? And I probably could only name 3 until 3 years ago when I became more involved with the Glass Museum. But that's something to kind of test. Can you name 5 women artists? So if you see an exhibit that has better equity, say thank you. If you see an exhibit that doesn't have good equity, tell them. And then join the Women's History Month campaign. More locally, there's a Art Plus Feminism Edit-a-thon happening next weekend at the Rakau at the Glass Museum. So Wikipedia is notoriously famous for not having very much content on women. So you don't have to know how to Wikipedia edit, they'll teach you, but you come, even if you just want to stay for an hour, and you'll be live updating Wikipedia pages. And then they have a panel discussion over lunch. Okay, last thing. So what can you do? What can you personally do? I think you can personally reach out to people you don't normally follow. You can personally accept stories as fact and not try to deny what the person is telling you because it doesn't fit your frame of reference. So stop answering when people share something, start listening. Reach out to all kinds of women. Attend NSBE and Nobuche. There's a lot of, for materials, there's a lot of interaction in what those organizations do. If you get invited to something that you feel like, gosh, there's not a lot of representation there, maybe I shouldn't attend, you could consider declining. And the one thing that I didn't write down on here that I'm working really hard on is dropping the word guys from my vocabulary. Hey guys, what's up? What do you guys want to do today? What shall we do? It really is gendered. And you hear a lot of women use it, and therefore it must be okay. But in fact, it really is gendered. And language evolves. And I think it's okay to let go of some of the things that we feel like, but I'm really comfortable using that word. It doesn't mean that I think that we should hold on to it. Okay, that's the end, actually. And 5 minutes left for questions. Sorry, but thank you.